I grew up in a quiet patch of rural Kansas, where wide fields stretched as far as my eyes could see. Most days, I rode my bike along the dusty roads to reach school, watching the sun inch its way over the horizon. My parents did not have much to offer in the way of fancy gadgets. This was long before I had even heard of carrying a phone. But I never felt deprived. I loved the freedom of pedaling down those long, open routes, with just the hum of my tires and the gentle breeze for company. My father, a practical soul, took special care to keep my bike in good shape. He oiled the chain, checked the brakes, and always reminded me to watch for traffic on those lonely roads. He was not the talkative type, but I knew he worried. I could see it in the way he would furrow his brow each time I swung a leg over the bike and headed off on my own. My mother was more open about her concerns, fussing over my lunches and checking if my shoelaces were tied. She insisted I come straight home from school each day, no detours allowed. Both of them were particularly strict about the cornfield that sprawled behind our house. My father warned me that folks sometimes pass through, and not all of them meant well. My mother, on the other hand, had a guarded expression whenever the subject of the field came up. She refused to explain her fears in detail, but I caught the tremor in her voice whenever she told me never to set foot among those towering stalks. Despite their warnings, there was something about that field that sparked my curiosity. From the road, the corn plants seemed almost magical in how they formed tall walls, whispering secrets to each other whenever the wind blew. I would ride past on my way home and imagine hidden paths twisting through the green. More than once I tried peeking into those dim corridors, but I always felt as though the plants themselves were watching me. I remember summer evenings listening to crickets and watching the stalks shimmer in the light of the setting sun. Sometimes, the wind would die down completely, and an eerie hush would settle. In those moments, a soft rustling could start up for no reason I could explain. My mother insisted it was merely the wind picking up again, but I always sensed there was something else moving among the leaves. Though I believed I was a cautious child, a part of me longed to find out what might be tucked away beyond the edges of that farmland. I knew my parents wanted to keep me safe, but I could not help wondering if their fears were shaped by something real. If I let my imagination wander, I pictured figures lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to step into view. Even so, I told myself I was just being fanciful. After all, it was only a cornfield, nothing more than rows and rows of plants, or so I thought at the time. I pedaled home from school late one afternoon, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. My bike had always been reliable, so the sudden snap of the chain caught me off guard. At first, I could not believe what happened. I tried pedaling again, but the chain just spun uselessly. Without a phone to call for help, I found myself stuck on the roadside, the sun dipping slowly behind the fields. I stood there, feeling the heat on the back of my neck, trying to decide what to do next. My father would have said to push the bike the whole distance, but the idea of trudging along that empty road for hours discouraged me. I thought of my mother's stern warnings not to take risks, but temptation nudged at me every time I looked at the tall cornfield that seemed to lead straight to our house. I took a long look at those rows of green stalks. They were so much taller than me, forming what resembled a winding passageway I had only ever peered into from a safe distance. I replayed my parents' cautionary tales in my head, but convinced myself they were being overprotective. If I cut through the corn, I might save myself an exhausting walk under the sun. That reasoning, flimsy though it was, propelled me forward. With my broken bike in hand, I stepped off the road and onto a dirt patch by the edge of the corn. A cool shade offered relief from the bright light. I told myself I had made the sensible choice. After all, the field was right there, promising a shorter route home. What could possibly go wrong if I kept my head down and hurried? Within a few steps, I noticed the hush that settled over the plants. My heart started thudding. There was no rustling breeze, no chirp of insects, just a thick silence. Then off to my left, I heard what sounded like something brushing against the leaves, stopping whenever I froze in place. My pulse quickened as I realized this noise did not seem to be caused by the wind. The memory of my parents' dire warnings flared up again, and an uneasy sensation crept along my spine. My surroundings felt both welcoming and threatening all at once. The cool shade clashing with an unsettling awareness that I was not alone. Yet I kept going, telling myself I just needed to push through. All the while, that faint sound persisted, following in time with my footsteps, as though something or someone was watching me from within those endless rows of corn. I pressed on through the darkening rows, my broken bike rattling beside me. With each careful step, I could sense the hushed movement of something beyond my line of sight. I tried to ignore the hammering in my chest, but it grew harder every time the corn stalks shifted in a way that did not match my own progress. My palms went clammy on the handlebars, and I started wishing I had stayed on the dusty road after all. Then I heard a voice, a low, scratchy call that made me jump. It came from somewhere off to my right, and I spun around to see a figure through the tall stalks. The man who stepped into my path looked ragged, with torn sleeves exposing scratches on his forearms. His eyes fixed on me with a strange intensity that sent an icy chill racing through my veins. He said he could help me fix my bike, but his unsteady voice made me take a step backward. I watched him inch closer, and in the fading light I noticed the dirt clinging to his clothes, the frantic way he glanced around as if searching for something more than just me. The stench of sweat and something else, maybe stale earth, filled my nostrils. He reached out, mumbling about tools and spare parts, offering a shaky smile that never quite reached his eyes. A voice deep inside told me to run, but I froze, unsure whether to trust his words or bolt through the rows. The moment he reached for my arm, my fear exploded. I pulled away, letting my bike clatter to the ground. In that split second, he lunged, and I dodged with a burst of adrenaline I did not know I had. The cornstalks crackled as I sprinted between them, each step sending dirt flying. My ears rang from the pounding of my own heartbeat, and I could hear him calling after me, swearing he meant no harm. But the rasp in his voice told me otherwise. I stumbled over roots and tangled leaves, only able to keep moving by the sheer force of panic. At one point, I ducked low behind the dense stalks, holding my breath as he thundered past, muttering nonsense under his breath. My lungs burned, and tears pricked at my eyes. I had never felt so small or so vulnerable, surrounded by an ocean of corn with no clear path out. But eventually a sliver of fading sunlight guided me, and I burst from the field onto a patch of open ground. Shaking and breathless, I reached our yard, half expecting the man to be right behind me. Inside, my mother gasped at the sight of dirt on my clothes, and my father, his voice tight, asked me what happened. He rushed out at once to check for my bike, but it was gone, swallowed up by the same silent rouse I had just escaped. That night I lay awake, my mind swirling with images of scratched arms and that haunting offer of help I knew I never should have trusted. I barely slept during the first few nights after my escape from the cornfield. The memory of that stranger, with his tattered clothes and scratched arms, haunted my thoughts. My father spent every evening scanning the farmland, hoping to catch some trace of my lost bike or signs of the man. My mother, red-eyed from worry, hovered by the window, looking out at the rows of corn that seemed darker than they ever had before. A few days later, my father came home defeated, admitting he had found nothing but broken stalks in the area where I ran. The local sheriff drove by once or twice, but there were no lads to go on. My mother grew so uneasy that she demanded I not leave the house unless one of them accompanied me. I felt guilty for stirring such fear in our home, yet I also understood their concern. None of us could be sure that I was truly safe. Those weeks dragged on, with a heavy tension thickening the air. At night, every small noise made me jump. I imagined footsteps outside, or hands brushing against the window, though each time my father went to look, he saw only the rustling of the corn stalks. My mother tried to comfort me, saying it was all in my head, but I could see she was not convinced either. We both heard those faint sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. Then one morning, a sight on our porch froze me in place. My old bike stood there, propped neatly against the railing. The chain was still snapped, and mud clung to the wheels in odd smears. My mother let out a gasp that sounded close to a sob, and my father's face went grim. Neither of them needed to say a word. We all understood that the stranger, or whatever force stirred in that cornfield, had brought it back to us. From that moment on, it felt impossible to carry on as though nothing had changed. My parents began quietly discussing moving away, determined to protect me from whatever danger they could not pin down. My father spoke to a realtor, and my mother started packing up keepsakes with trembling hands. Though part of me wanted to stay and see if the fear would pass, I knew deep down there was no peace for us here. Before long, our old house stood empty. We loaded our belongings into a battered truck and left the farmland behind, taking with us a lingering unease that no distance could fully erase. Though I felt relief to be leaving that harrowing chapter of my childhood, I often found myself glancing back at those rows of corn, wondering if the man was still out there and if he ever truly let me go.